There was an article in the Ringer, I think it was Ben Solak wrote about Nathaniel Hackett. And what he basically wrote was that the plan for the Broncos was to hire Nathaniel Hackett as a way to lure Aaron Rodgers, who not a free agent, but as a way to lure Aaron Rodgers to the team. So you could argue that was a hole in the plan. The fact
like
that
Devontae wanted to head back west.
Yeah. Now, Aaron had said, there was a quote in the article, at one point last year, Aaron said,
no, it was like 2 years ago. It was like 20
years ago.
Yeah.
I hope Nathaniel Hackett doesn't go anywhere, or at least as long as I'm here, or unless I go somewhere, whoever it was, you may remember. Yeah. So the Niners, Kyle Shanahan this week is playing a coach and a team on Sunday Night Football.
Because I would say, separate from even Rodgers, when Nate Hackett was the Broncos hire, it was a little weird. Yes. And everyone's just like, well, obviously it's a package deal with Rodgers because this guy was not going to be a head coach anywhere else. And did you see Kyle yesterday said that remember when LaFleur got the job in Green Bay and Kyle thought he might lose, Matt might hire Mike, remember, to the package deal? He said, I watched his press conference on Wednesday. He's like, I'd never met Nate, or we've never worked together, Nathaniel Hackett, but we were going to hire him potentially when we might have lost Mike to the Packers. Remember, they kind of blocked them, and people were like, this is fucked up. It's his brother. But he said that Hackett more than likely might have got that job, which LaFleur at the time, right, was the passing game coordinator. It would make some sense. That's what Hackett essentially was for LaFleur. So they're all kind of interconnected.
Yeah. Paul Hackett, of course, had coached with the Niners for a long time, his dad.
And he coached Kyle. He said when Kyle was worked for Gruden at Tampa, Hackett was the quarterback coach, and he's like, he was a huge mentor to me.
Paul.
Kyle really liked Paul Hackett.
Gotcha. Lives in Marin now. But per that Montana doc. So the Niners this week are playing this team that feels like it's in significant disarray. Now, maybe their defensive coordinator, who's also a UC Davis guy, is good. I mean, they haven't given up a lot of points this year.
You know, all their coordinators had never been coordinators before?
They did. And the part of that story that really blew my mind was that this is only the second time that Nathaniel Hackett's called plays. The other time he called plays, he didn't last the season.
The year before, though, they made the AFC Championship game when he was with the Jags.
Was he calling plays that year?
He was the play caller for the 17 team.
Okay.
Yeah, and then the next year, obviously, expectations sky high. Jags became the Jags again, and he didn't last long.
Kyle Shanahan, the monsoon was the excuse when they lost to the Bears. There would be no excuses for losing to the Broncos this week.
Well, they're favored on the road. I saw a bunch of people like a couple weeks ago, this is pretty crazy. Even if you're viewed both these two teams as being powerhouses, before we learned about the Broncos, before Trey got hurt, you would have been, me and you just went through the first month of lines, right? You would have been like Broncos -3 or Broncos -2, right? At home, Sunday Night Football against a young quarterback. Like they would have been favored because you would assume they would have looked solid. Even if you thought it was going to be bumpy, no one would have guessed it would have been. They're counting down the play clock last week in Denver, counting down the play clock. So this guy feels completely overwhelmed. One thing Kyle was asked about is like, they kind of piggybacked on this, like the struggles of making the transition to become a head coach. And Kyle's like, well, I just kind of leaned back on all my experiences of being a coordinator. Like you kind of like get put in pressure situations, even though it's only half the team. And you think about this guy really doesn't have that many experiences for years because the last 3 years, let's face it, he wasn't calling the plays. Like, to me, I'd be fascinated to ask like a Kyle Shanahan and Andy Reid or whoever, even LaFleur in Green Bay, when you're or McVay, the offensive coordinator for a head coach who's calling the plays, is your job really much closer to being the quarterback coach, or is it actually closer to being the coordinator? Like and maybe it changes team to team, coach to coach, but there's definitely a gap. Right.
Yeah. Well, like I'll give you an example. I talked to a guy who you know really well, who's a college coordinator, who actually he's a college quarterbacks coach, whose head coach calls the plays. And I asked him, how does this work exactly? Because anyone who follows football has heard about co-coordinators, and it's never, two situations are not identical. And he said the head coach calls most of the plays. Sometimes he'll say to me, hey, you got the next 5. Or one of his jobs as the quarterback coach is to stack up plays for the next drive. So he'll stack up plays. He'll tell the coach, here's what I think we should do. And the coach might use the plays that quarterback's coach, co-OC, has stacked up for him. But he might also
Because
mix
when they're on defense, the head coach is pretty locked in. He's focused on his kind of tasks.
That's right. So as the coach is watching his defense, the QB coach will make a list in order of plays he thinks they should call on the next drive, and sometimes he'll use them exactly, and sometimes he'll mix them up. So there's just one example of how it works with co-coordinators.
Well, think about being the head coach, right? When you're not even that comfortable being just the pure play caller, and you got all this shit going on, and then all of a sudden, 3 plays in, a turnover happens, and you got to start calling the plays again. I would imagine it's very, very overwhelming. Because on the flip side, there's like Belichick, who's been doing this since 1975 in the NFL, didn't freak out when the Marshawn Lynch thing happened and just looked at Pete Carroll and didn't call a timeout, right? Wasn't just complete, was like he was on a beach, yet it was a Super Bowl with time ticking. And that's the opposite end of the spectrum, right? The experience completely under control, deep breaths. Tomlin always looks pretty together on the sideline, like never looks overwhelmed. Now, granted, he's not calling plays. The Nate Hackett thing is looked, because the one thing you would say about Kyle Shanahan, we can nitpick an individual play call or whatever. He doesn't ever look overwhelmed on the sideline. Like he's been, I really think after those first couple of years, once they got good in 19, he feels very in control. McVay, same thing. He's maybe a little more emotional than Kyle, but like they're just very comfortable with what they're doing. The game plan, the execution, just the game.
But that's
because you've always argued that like a lot of coaches, and historically Andy took the most shit because he was a good coach in time management. And you're like, everyone acts like 90% of people are good. The overwhelming majority, time management, relative to us sitting on our couches, we always complain about it. It's clearly pretty hard, right?
Yeah, I think it's probably easier now, and this is part of the criticism for Hackett. It's not his play calling necessarily that's been criticized. It's the management of the game. But I think part of why he gets no benefit of the doubt now, which in hindsight, even Andy, like now every team, for the most part, you just hire a guy whose job it is to tell you when to go for it, when to use your timeouts.
It wasn't in that article, Nate had hired 7 different guys that do like 3 different things.
Yeah, it's like just have a guy. It's the NFL. You just pay him, tell you when to take the timeouts and when to go for it. Like, well, this shouldn't be a quote unquote decision, right? We talk like, oh, what's he going to do on 4th down? What's his decision? It's like, it's not a decision. You're just following the chart. Now, not everybody follows the chart all the time, but these charts they have, John, it's different than the charts that we have access to on the internet. Like they have specific charts for specific opponents. Every week, the chart's a little different, right?
And based on who they have active, what injuries have factored in. Like there are a lot of variables going on. There's a lot of variables.
But that
on an
part
NFL
has
game.
been the charts, like the game has changed in the last several years. It should
Dramatically.
That part of it should not be. Now, did his chart tell him to let the clock run and then kick a field goal on the road?
Yeah, I think that this guy last week when I watched the game with the sound on, the first play that I saw was the Broncos in punt return, and they were missing their punt returner, and he had to run out and call the timeout. Now, ultimately, Nate Hackett is not the special teams coach, right? It's not necessarily like his role to make sure if there's an injury, if someone rolls an ankle and you got to get a new returner, because that's what I would guess. Because usually, for the most part, punt return. The punt returner hears that and he goes with the group. I'm just going to guess there was an injury throughout the game that led to a transition. A lot going on. No one pays attention. But when you're the head coach, it all falls under your umbrella. And it does feel like a lot of stuff is happening under his umbrella that's loosey-goosey.
Yeah. And I think we look at the Bears and think, I at least look at the Bears. We talked about this before the Bears game that we both picked the Niners to win and cover. That there's a chance their coach is really good. Their coach has been a fantastic defense. Eberflus,
yeah. You're saying
has been a very good defensive coordinator, right? There's a chance that he's just a good coach. There's nothing when you watch the Bears that makes you think they are substandard when it comes to NFL coaching. Time will tell.
Also handled a weird situation, right? Got hired to a job. The head coach didn't show up,
right.
And it was like, listen, I don't think it's going to work, but I will not dispute like Eberflus's credentials as a quote unquote, just like defensive guy, right?
Yeah. Whereas Hackett, again, I understand why he's there. I even if it's a 10% chance of getting Aaron Rodgers, I think you have to take that chance. Do you agree with that?
I don't blame the Broncos for doing absolutely anything they've done, even if it's going to ruin their franchise, right? if you said, hey, you hire this guy, you have, I think the chances felt a lot higher than 10. Let's say it felt 50.
Yeah.
Every single person in the history of football would hire Nate Hackett if you think like this is a pretty good chance to get Aaron Rodgers. Then when that doesn't go through, to me, think how lucky the football gods to just get a guy who's a Hall of Famer who's 32 years old. Now, we can factor in the weirdness, whatever, all the other variables. You would have made that trade. Every single team in league history, given their circumstance, what they had on their roster, and what they had to trade to give them, is there any team that wouldn't have made that trade to get Russell Wilson?
No.
And then once you trade for him, like do you even blame them for giving him the contract? Like just extend him, give him a contract. No. So it's like, now I don't think it's going to work, but I can't fault them for making any of these. Like to me, a lot of people have been saying, why would they give up 3 first-round picks for the project? You can have an argument over that, right? Logic, jumping up to get a quarterback that then evaluate.
We can argue to what degree he's a project. Is he more ready than some people think? Whatever. Yeah.
The Broncos moves
by the book.
If I just would have told you Aaron Rodgers wasn't even in play, Nate Hackett, would you take Nate Hackett to get Russell Wilson? Because that was, I saw Albright has tweeted out, I think we were linked on he was responding to people that Russell was also good to go with Nate Hackett. Like,
gotcha.
Because in fairness to Russell, he influenced the Rams hire, right, when they got Shane Waldron up in Seattle. He really wanted to implement that offense. He pushed Pete, and Pete capitulated, and that's why they ended up with a coach from down there. So it's like, I don't blame them. Like, I think Russell's a weirdo, but I also would want him at my quarterback instead of Drew Lock and Teddy Bridgewater. I mean,
yeah,
right? It's a no-brainer.
Yeah.
Now he just looks off now, and I think sometimes in the history of sports trades, right? When we were kids, football did not make as many trades as like basketball and baseball. For every no-brainer one that works out and you trade for some future MVP, there have been a lot historically that don't work. More. Even though at the time it was like, God, I would have made that trade too. Eventually, some of these are going to backfire, right? I mean, some of them just do not work. Remember the Patriots a couple years ago, I think traded like a 2nd and 3rd round pick for Mohamed Sanu, backfired. The Rams last year, 2nd and 3rd round pick for Von Miller, which I would say that's not as crazy as some of these 1st round picks, but in NFL circles, that most GMs would be like, that's a lot, right? For a rental that's going to leave, and it worked out perfectly.
Only because they won the championship, it worked out.
But Vaughn was helped them win.
No, but most trades are not, at least on paper, 32 is past prime, but in the NFL, you should still be a prime age quarterback, right?
Yeah.
Most trades don't involve that guy, and they did with Russ, which is weird. It's a red flag in and of itself that guy's getting traded from an organization that tries to win every year, but does not rebuild.
Honestly, the story even dates back, like the more some of these things leaked, that like they were very interested in trading him in 2018. 2018. It was like, well, new GM, new coach. No, it was the guys that drafted him and won a Super Bowl and went to another one with him. It's like the guy that, like, why is John Schneider? You could argue how well thought of he is currently, but like, why at points in time in his career, like John Schneider, one of the best GMs ever. He was the guy that pounded the table for little Russell Wilson. So the guy that pounded the table for the quarterback, who then became a Hall of Famer, was thinking about trading him 7 years later. That's an all-time red flag, is it not?
Yes, it is.
Who's playing well, right? It wasn't, Wentz. It was like, well, he sucked. Like Russell in 18, wasn't he trending up?
18. I mean, was it 20 that he looked like the MVP for half the year?
I thought like the stretch from like 18, 19, and 20, it was like, is Russell just in the peak of his powers? How does he get that much better than this guy?
Or maybe it was 21. Maybe it was last year that Russ spent the first half of the year.
Schneider's like, give me the guy from Fireball. Take the little man off my hands.
Yeah. I will risk it all again. I will trade Russ. In 18, it would have been even crazier than it felt in 21.
Would have been nuts for Josh Allen.
For Josh Allen? I mean, when you really think about it, if he had done that, he would be viewed right. He would be on his way to the Hall of Fame.
Assuming that Josh would have became Josh.
I'm just saying, he would be on his way to the Hall of Fame.
If Josh became Josh, it would have been one of the great transactions. Like, just wait, you drafted Russ in the 3rd round, then you utilized him to kick ass, take names, and then you pivoted in a weird way when everyone thought you were nuts for a guy that's better.
They would have got more for Russ then than they got this year, too.
Yeah. Well, Russ, you and I remember talked about it, like Russ straight up for the number 1 pick. Like, what would it have taken? Russ, the number 1 pick, and then like another one, or the number one pick's a lot.
I think you would have got more. I think at that time, especially in 18, you're looking at Russ like a
Number one pick,
Hall of
like
Famer.
Russ, the number one pick, and like a 1 and a 2.
Well, just look at number one picks. I mean, we're flipping. Who was the number one pick that year?
Baker Mayfield.
Yeah, I mean, we're fucking flipping coins,
I know.
and everyone knows it.
But we know the chart, the value of the first pick is really high relative to the 14.
But I still think it's worth. I think a Hall of Fame quarterback in his prime is worth more than 1-1, even if it's number one.
I mean, they've really
like John. What are you going to do with this pick? Just curious. Josh Allen. Like, okay, yeah. Here's Real Deal Sports on the stream says, I don't care about the stats and the struggles. We need a win on Sunday over a team that's looked extremely mediocre thus far. You know what I thought of when I started thinking about kind of this matchup in terms of the coaches was the Mike Pettin quote when the Browns played the Jim Tomsula Niners. And Mike Pettin said, basically, everyone's making fun of us. I just drove by. They got their building's on fire. And that's how I think you should look at the Broncos right now.
I think Kyle was OC at the time he said that.
Kyle was the Browns OC that year?
He was definitely the Browns OC 1 year with Mike Pettin. I don't know if it was that year.
Head-to-head with Tom.
I think it was 14. I think that might have been 2015. So he might have just missed him.